our short interview series where we're talking about talking to different housing practitioners and experts and people who care about these issues. My name is Mike Lofton. I'm the CEO of HomeWise, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. Today, we have a really special guest, Kelly O'Donnell, who is the director of Home Wisdom, and she's going to tell you more about that. And appreciate you joining us today, Kelly. And we're going to talk about your paper, who can't afford to live in Santa Fe in 2020. Kind of interesting title. But first of all, Kelly, why don't you tell us about Home Wisdom and what is that?
Well, Home Wisdom is HomeWise's effort to inform the debates about affordable housing with independent research in order that policymakers and the general public can make informed decisions about these issues on the basis of evidence.
Right. Which is a good thing to be looking at actual evidence, huh? So no, it's great. And I think this is a very exciting project because I think there is a lot of housing discussions and home ownership discussions oftentimes aren't informed by good data. And so we're kind of going by gut instincts, and that's, that can lead you to make some mistakes. So it's great that you're working on this. So you just came out with this paper called Who Can't Afford to Live in Santa Fe, which is an interesting title, like I said. And we know that, Santa Fe people have known for a long time that Santa Fe is an expensive housing market. But this last year, the median home price just went over $600,000, which is the first time that's ever happened. I think you mentioned that in your paper that part of that median home price is a 30% increase in home prices in 1 year alone, which I've been doing this for 30 years in Santa Fe, and I've never seen it this nutty. So tell us more about this. What is tell us about the affordable housing crisis in Santa Fe and how families are not able to keep up with it.
Sure. I mean, as you noted, affordable housing has been an issue in Santa Fe for as long as I can remember. I commuted to Santa Fe for 10 years from Albuquerque as a young parent, and I did so because I couldn't afford to live in Santa Fe as a state employee. It turns out that over a third of people who work in Santa Fe don't actually live in Santa Fe. They live outside the county. And that is in large part due to the fact that they simply can't afford to purchase a home in Santa Fe. The other issue is that folks who want to live within a decent proximity of where they work have no choice but to absorb really high housing costs. And that's good. There's a large percentage of the population who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, a significant percentage, particularly amongst renters. So we have a situation where we have a lot of jobs in Santa Fe, a lot to recommend Santa Fe, but many of the people who work in Santa Fe cannot afford to live there. And thus they live in Albuquerque or Rio Rancho or Espanola, outlying areas, and end up commuting sometimes hours a day in order to get to work.
Right. Well, and just so for people who don't necessarily know the geography of Santa Fe, when you say a third of the workforce commutes outside of Santa Fe County, that's not like a 10-minute drive over the city limits. That's like an hour drive in Albuquerque. It's not a small commute.
Yeah, the average commute in Santa Fe is 46 minutes one way. So that's 90 minutes as an average. But many people commute far longer.
Right. Yeah. Well, so home prices are going through the roof. What's going rents, which you talked about in your paper too. What's going on with wages? Because I heard that during COVID, everyone's making a lot more money now.
Well, some people are making a lot more money during COVID. I think COVID was advantageous to certain people, certain populations, and very disadvantageous to other populations. I think some of the populations that were most damaged by the shutdown as a result of COVID are folks who are really involved in the economy in Santa Fe. I mean, tourism is an enormous sector for Santa Fe, but many of the people who work in that sector lost their jobs. So we really have a situation of great disparity where certain segments of the population, the white collar workforce in large part, didn't suffer too badly as a result of COVID, whereas the service sector suffered terribly and experienced huge displacement. So we've got a sort of a convergence of a number of factors. We've got rapidly escalating home prices, in part, due to a number of factors. But one of them is that people are more mobile. And so upper middle income people can afford to live in Santa Fe and work in San Francisco, let's say. We've got inflation that is starting to take off, and that's a very significant factor as well. And we've got wage growth that is stagnant relative to the increase in costs of everything else, essentially. So while we saw that 30% increase in the median home price in Santa Fe, during that same period, we saw a 2.7% increase in the average wage for Santa Fe workers.
And that's a Santa Fe number.
That's a Santa Fe specific number, yeah.
No, that's super interesting. I don't know how you keep up with housing costs in this market. What about other parts of the house the affordable housing problem here? I mean, we talked about the median price of a home, but rents have also gone up. I know the vacancy rate is very low for rental housing. Production of new housing hasn't been a lot of it, which is another reason that we're experiencing this problem. Tell us more about the overall affordability problem.
Well, I mean, Santa Fe has for years, like a lot of the country, suffered from underinvestment in affordable housing. I mean, there just simply isn't enough affordable housing to meet the demand in Santa Fe or in many, many other cities. So, yeah, as a result, we have extremely low rental vacancy rates, which, of course, puts upward pressure on rents. So we've got rents growing, and we know that those rents are highly burdensome to low income and moderate income Santa Fe residents, because those renters that we're talking about are sometimes spending over 50% of their income on rent, and they're not getting any unlike a homeowner, this is not an investment. This is a pure outlay of cash. So we know that we have highly cost-burdened renters, and we've seen some development. There's been some talk about new multifamily housing, but the vast, vast majority of that housing is market rate, totally unaffordable to many of the people who are currently renting in Santa Fe. But I think, one of the bigger issues, in addition to the lack of rental apartments, is the lack of affordable home ownership opportunities. When you look at the people who are commuting into Santa Fe, as opposed to living there, they are often young families. These are people who want to buy a home and simply cannot buy a home in Santa Fe. So I think while we certainly need more affordable rentals, we also need more affordable homes for renters to move into. So starter homes, for instance, are almost impossible to find in Santa Fe, whereas you can go to Rio Rancho, an hour away, and obtain one.
Well, and that's been my experience doing this for a long time, is when people who are working in Santa Fe and living in Santa Fe, when they leave to Albuquerque, it's typically when they decide they want to own a home.
Exactly.
They struggle with the rents here, but they okay, I want to own a home. I can't do it here. So now I think that problem just got worse. And it's really important for the rental market too, because if people aren't buying homes, their apartment never frees up for somebody else.
Exactly.
Right,
and it's a phenomenon that is not unique to Santa Fe, this suburbanization, people moving out of the central city as their kids age and they need need a bigger house. But that's not an inevitability. I mean, that's the result of a lack of affordable housing. If Santa Fe wants to continue to grow and be a vibrant city with young families and a strong workforce, it has to become more hospitable to working age people and families. And the only real way to do that is to develop the homes that those people can afford to buy and invest in. And that's the way to keep young people in Santa Fe and keep the economy and the cultural environment vibrant.
Right. Yeah, your report said that roughly a third of Santa Fe households are considered rent burden, right? Which means they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. That's a third of everybody, which is a lot of people. When you look at low income households, that number for renters goes up to 70% of renters are cost burden, right? It's lower for homeowners, but it's still a lot. It can be a lot for low income people. So it's like, talk to us about cost burden and why that matters so much to families and the community. And, it seems like that puts families under a lot of financial stress when they're spending that much money on housing.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, housing costs are almost inevitable, right? So if you're spending 30% of your income on housing, that leaves 70, well, after taxes, closer to 50%, but of your income for other necessities. But the larger the chunk of income that housing eats, the more likely you are to have to make some really painful trade-offs. Trade-offs like purchasing groceries that aren't perhaps what you'd buy otherwise. Healthcare, childcare. These are all expenses that working families face. And the larger the share of their income that's going to housing, the less they have to spend. And New Mexico is a poor state. And thus, these are not theoretical trade-offs. These are trade-offs that are being made by working families every day.
Right. Well, and there's, housing is an intersectional issue, right? It affects a lot of other things. So you just talked about how it affects housing costs affects the quality of life of a family. What about the rest of the community and employers and the economy and, just the vibrancy of a place?
Right. Well, New Mexico has struggled for a long time with economic development. I mean, it's a perennial concern here because we have a hard time recruiting and retaining employers. And the major issue that's pointed to often is the lack of workforce. So right now, Santa Fe is in a good place in the sense that it's providing a lot of jobs. However, as the population ages, there are going to be fewer and fewer people to fill those jobs. And there's going to be more and more competition for those people. So it's absolutely critical that Santa Fe secure that population of current workers and future workers by enabling them to actually put down roots in Santa Fe.
Right. Well, there was just a big article in the local paper in the New Mexican yesterday that talked about the shortage of healthcare workers. Mm-hmm. And to what degree, and then obviously there's this huge shortage of teachers as well. That's been in the papers a lot. What about those sectors? What do we need to do on housing so we do have enough healthcare workers and enough police officers and enough teachers?
Well, that's another issue that the whole state faces. Santa Fe faces it, but New Mexico faces it too. How do we get and keep an adequate supply of healthcare workers, teachers, public safety officers, police officers, prison guards? I mean, that whole population of people who deliver all the services that we depend on a daily basis. How do we actually get them to come here and stay here? Or better yet, not leave as they grow up and become adults. And again, home ownership is a huge opportunity to provide frontline workers with a leg up in the sense of an opportunity to own a home and sort of build on that base. So I think that home ownership and making home ownership available to a broader swath of workers, particularly those frontline workers about which we're so concerned right now, is absolutely critical to supporting a growing economy.
Well, I think that's a really good place to end. It's we have our work cut out for us. New Mexico does, and Santa Fe does, and HomeWise does. So I really appreciate you spending time on this stuff. We're going to do this again sometime, I hope.
I hope so too.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.